Good evening and welcome. We're going to sing two hymns this evening, so if you prefer the hymn book, it's number 16, O Worship the King, and number 18, Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing. We're going to sing the first and last of both songs. First and last of both songs. Would you stand as we sing? Across the page is Come Thou Fount of Every Blessing, the first and the last. Join us now as we welcome and fellowship.
As we get started tonight, we'll take your prayer concerns in just a minute, but if you do not have one of our timelines that we're going to be using for the first two sessions. They are over here on the banister over there. If you'll raise your hand, Matthew will bring it to you. He needs a little bit more exercise for the day, so raise your hand. April needs one. Be sure to take one to her. But this will, if nothing else, it will help you keep straight the timeline as we're going, at least for this week and the next week. And on the back, I figured out that you could put handy-dandy note-taking lines on the back as to not waste the back side of the paper. And at the bottom of the back side where the lines are, one of the helpful resources that I've shared with you before is the timeline online, the interactive one that you can use. The web address for that is down here at the bottom. I've never looked at it on a device like an iPad or a phone or anything like that. So I don't know how it looks there. I know how it looks on my computer because that's where I use it the bulk of the time. So there's some information. I'm going to talk about this for those of you that are watching at home. Are we on the internet right now? Okay. For those of you looking at home, if you want to stop by the church, we'll have them in the church office, and you can pick up one there. They will not be on the presentation slides tonight. So as we get started, we do want to take your prayer concerns tonight, and we'll get those into the bulletin in the week ahead of, or the week to come. And so we need to remember. with our prayer concerns, with our Bible study. The birds got me all flustered. And so tonight we are continuing in our study of the timeline of the Bible. And so over the next several months as we do our study, we're going to be looking at the chronology of the Bible, or from that perspective anyway. And so tonight we are in the first portion of the Bible, looking at the timeline from creation to the Tower of Babel. And so on your handout there, you'll see some information and things, and you'll hear me mention some of this as we go through. I probably won't point out things on the timeline too much, but it's a good resource to have in hand and to work from. One thing I do want to mention to you is if you go online and you look at the online timeline that I gave you, the website's on the back of the handout. If you look at it, the date difference between the 4004 BC date that we talked about last week that we're using now and the date of creation that they use is a difference of about 50 years. Is that a big deal? Not really. But you know, again, like we said last week, it could be 4000 BC, it could be 3900 BC. We don't know with certainty, but we're going based off of the information from the Usher date that was given that we're using. And so if you use that and the date is off a little bit from what we say using this study, it's only because of that. And so as far as looking at the creation, from creation to the Tower of Babel, we're going to be using Genesis 1 through 11, but the dates fall basically between 4004 BC and 2200 BC. That's the time period that we're going to be looking at. So we're going to cover essentially 1800 years of biblical history tonight in just 11 chapters. And so there's a lot to be covered, and so my recommendation would be to have your Bibles open to Genesis chapter 1, and as we move through, what you'll be able to do is you'll be able to just sort of flip through your Bible and see some of the things that we are mentioning as we go through. Now, the events that are included in this roughly 1,800 years, almost 2,000 years of history, include the creation event, the fall of mankind, the flood, and the Tower of Babel. Those are the four big, overwhelming events that we're going to be looking at tonight. And you see on the screen there the different chapters of the Bible that they include. Chapter 5 is not in there because it is a genealogy, and chapter 10 is technically a genealogy, but it tail ends out of the flood story with Noah, so I left it there. But that is basically the breakdown of the events over the 1,800 years that we're going to be looking at tonight. And so the first one we see there is creation, and that's Genesis 1 and 2. And so what we see in Genesis 1 and 2 are basically just two recollections or accounts of the creation event. And the difference is Genesis chapter 1 is an overview of everything from the moment God said, "Let there be light," until technically the first few verses of chapter 2 when God is resting on the seventh day. And so our view of chapter 1 breaks down the different days and what occurs. And on the handout, you'll see up there on the sort of top left hand, the creation event, what happens in each of those and where it's recorded in the scriptures. You know, day 1, God creates light in verses 1 through 5. The second day, he creates the sky, which is the separation of the firmament, on verses 6 through 8. Verses 9 through 13, he created on the third day earth, or earth, dry land, seas, and vegetation. On day 4, we see that God created the sun, the moon, and the stars in verses 14 through 19. Day 5 are the air and sea animals in verses 20 through 23. And then day 6 are land animals and man. And then day 7 is the day of rest. And so as we look, Genesis 2, if you think about it, Genesis 1 is an overview of the entire creation event. But then you have Genesis chapter 2, which is a more detailed account of just the sixth day of creation. And that's one of the things that people will say is, well, if creation occurred, why are there two different chapters telling two different stories about the creation event? Well, chapter 1 is an overview of the entire event, and chapter 6 is sort of a narrowed down, or chapter 2 is a narrowed down view of just the sixth day when God created man and the land animals. And so that's the difference between the two accounts. But as we discussed last time, these events occurred according to our record of time, man's record of time, somewhere around 4000 BC. And one thing that is regularly questioned about the timing of the creation events is whether or not those are 24-hour periods of time that we know as a day, or are they sort of like we hear in 2 Peter 3:8 and a place in Psalms where reference is made to a day lasting how much in God's time? 1,000 years, right? 1,000 years there is a day is as 1,000 years. And so that's the question that sometimes comes in. And if that's the case, well, we would look back at the original text, right? We would look at it and say, okay, does it give us any indication that there is anything beyond a 24-hour period of time as we know it being described here? And from the original text and the grammar, it would imply that this, when it says in Genesis 1 that it's a day, it's made the first day, there's nothing that tells us anything other than it would be a 24-hour period of time. And so I want to throw you back into our study of Revelation a few years ago. And if you remember our study of Revelation by Tim LaHaye's, using Tim LaHaye's book, he gave us a great biblical interpretation rule to use. And it's one that I use on a daily basis preparing for Bible studies, and I hope that you will as well. And I'm going to read it to you. He said, when the plain sense of Scripture makes common sense, seek no other sense. Take every word at its primary, ordinary, usual, literal meaning, unless the facts of the immediate text clearly indicate otherwise. So when we read the creation event, there's nothing there indicating that we ought to think of it as 1,000 years or anything like that, or that it's anything other than a 24-hour day period. And the original Hebrew reads that way. And so there's no reason for us to think that it's anything other than a 24-hour period of time. Now, let's just say Pastor Nick is wrong in this. And those 24-hour period days are actually 1,000 years. If there's 6 days of creation, how many more years are we going to add to the timeline? 6,000, right? That would be the max. And again, that would put the age of the earth at closer to 10,000 if that were the case, than 4,000. Well, 10,000 BC. But I guess that would be 12,000 total. But instead of the 6,000 that we have right now. But that's not even close to the millions and billions of years old that people claim that the earth has been around. And so what we see is that the earth has been around for about 6,000 years, and according to the creation events, God created these events over a set 6-day period. Now, we know that if we transition into chapter 3 and 4 of Genesis, we see the downfall of mankind into sin, but also the ramifications and the results on the family of Adam and Eve, because in Genesis 3 through 5, and again 5 is really a genealogy, we read about mankind's fall into sin. And in chapter 3 we read about Adam and Eve's disobedience of God's command to not eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And with that disobedience, with them breaking his command, what we see is that sin is introduced into the world, and the perfect relationship that Adam and Eve had with God is broken. And that brings in a whole slew of problems, because now sin has entered the world, and every person that would be born after them would have a sin nature and would be impacted by sin and would be spiritually separated from God because of sin. And so we see that God banished Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden before they would have an opportunity to eat from the tree of life. And so God, that's, his part of his punishment there for their sin. We read in chapter 3 of God's curse on man, curse on woman, and his curse on the serpent or Satan. But in chapter 4, we start reading about Cain and Abel, Adam and Eve's sons. And we see that Adam has taught them what it means to worship God and what it means to bring a sacrifice to God. And Cain is worshiping God, offering him some of, as the scripture says, some of his fruits. And Abel is bringing his flocks and bringing the best of his flocks, the first of his flocks, the first fruits from his flocks, so to speak. And as we read in chapter 4, we know that God accepted Abel's sacrifice, but he didn't accept Cain's. And Cain ended up killing Abel, and God marked and banished Cain as a result of that. And so sin has entered the world, Adam and Eve's disobedience, and it immediately has ramifications on Cain and Abel. Now let me ask you, what did Cain kill Abel with? I've asked this before when we studied Genesis. Everybody always says it was a rock, right? I found out this week where that came from. It's a Jewish tradition. Now, that doesn't mean that it's right. It's just I found out this week that it was a Jewish tradition. When we studied the first part of Genesis a year and a half ago, I had no idea where that came from, but I found that this week as studying for this timeline, that is actually a Jewish tradition. But nevertheless, the events in what we read to be Genesis 3 and 4, they occurred somewhere between 4004 BC, if you look on your timeline, between 4004 BC and 3874 BC. Because that is when Seth is born, and we know from the scriptures that all of the event with Adam and Eve and the fall of mankind, it happened in the first 130 years of after creation, because Seth is born at when Adam is 130 years old, and Cain has already killed Abel, and Cain has been banished. So we know when the fall of mankind and Cain and Abel occurred. We just don't know whether that happened at the first or in the middle or at the end of that 130-year period. And so we aren't told how long Adam and Eve were in the garden before they sinned, or how old Adam was when Cain and Abel were born, but we do know when his son Seth was born. And those dates, as you see, tell you on the timeline, tells you the name of the individual in Adam's genealogy, how long they lived, and then what years BC that would have corresponded with for their life. And so after the fall of mankind, we run into the flood, because after Adam and Eve sin, humanity basically takes a spiritual nosedive. And what ends up happening is in chapter 6, we start reading about how mankind has become so sinful at this point that God actually is quoted as saying that he regretted creating mankind. That's how sinful man had become by this point. And he only found one righteous man in the whole lot. No pun intended for the later biblical stories. But he found one person, and that was Noah. And so he commanded Noah to build an ark that would be so large that it would hold 2 of every animal on earth, dinosaurs included. Remember, dinosaurs were on the ark. And all 2 of each animal, Noah's family, and all the provisions that they would need. And this flood that would come would wipe out everything with the breath of life in it. And so for 100 years, Noah preached repentance. You want to talk about a preacher that did not get discouraged or depressed, it had to be Noah. Because if he preached for 100 years and didn't quit and didn't have a single convert, oh man. They talk about the patience of Job. You talk about the resilience of Noah. But nevertheless, he preached for 100 years while working on the boat. Interestingly, if you look on the timeline there, individuals who could have helped him work on the boat would have included Methuselah and his father and Noah's father Lamech, not just his son. So there's a chance that they could have been ones helping to build the ark. But nevertheless, he got the ark built. And what we know is that the flood occurred, or it started to rain, and this was the first time that it had rained in the 1600 years since the creation event, because the world had been watered, vegetation had been watered by the dew, as the scriptures tell us. And so you imagine how crazy Noah was, telling people, I'm building an ark because a flood is coming. Well, what's a flood? It's when there's a whole lot of rain. Well, what's rain? I mean, that's literally the conversation that Noah probably had many times over that 100 years. But nevertheless, Noah took his family into the ark, and they stayed there for a whole year. You know, we always talk about the flood of Noah, and it's like, it rained for 40 days and 40 nights. Yeah, but then they were on the boat for another 11 months, you know, floating on top of the water. You talk about a fun family vacation. Maybe not so much of a fun family vacation, but they were in there for a whole year, according to the scriptures. And so after the flood, we know that Noah and his family come out of the ark, and they begin repopulating the world. And when we read the scriptures linearly, we think, you know, we read this in chapter 9 into chapter 10, and we get a genealogy, and then chapter 11 is about the Tower of Babel. We get the viewpoint that this happened, you know, just within a few months, and you know, Noah and his family had just barely spread out, and they built the Tower of Babel, and then God spread them across the world. But what we'll see is that there was actually a pretty good time gap there between the flood and the repopulation of the world over a 100-year time period there. But nevertheless, after the flood, we see the Tower of Babel occurring in Genesis chapter 11. And we find that Noah's descendants attempted to build a tower to the sky that would make a name for them. That was their purpose. They were building a city and wanted to build a tower to the sky to make a name for themselves. That's how prideful they were. That's what they wanted to accomplish, was to build a tower into the sky. And the tower, you know, I remember seeing pictures when I was a kid of representations of the Tower of Babel, and it looked like the Leaning Tower of Pisa. I mean, that's what it looked like, you know, just a regular tower. But, you know, Pastor Nick has done a little reading rather than just looking at the pictures. But what you find is that was actually most likely a ziggurat type pyramid that was built in the Sumerian region there. And so it was probably a multi-layered pyramid, most likely, with an altar at the top. That's typically what that would have been. So, and it would have probably been a very large one, to say the very least. But they built it in the plain in Shinar. And Shinar is the Babylonian region, or Babylonia. And so that is modern-day Iraq. We know where Babylon was. It was in modern-day Mosul in Iraq. And so we don't know that that's specifically where the tower was built, but it was in that region, in that area. And so before they could complete the tower, God comes down. He confuses their language and then spreads them across the globe, and really does more to expand Noah's family across the globe than they did any before that, really. So the Tower of Babel is believed to have occurred about 100 years after the flood. That's when it's believed. You see there on your timeline the blue line, which is the flood in 2348. All the way to 2347 BC. About 100 years later, give or take, it would have been, the Tower of Babel would have been around that time, around 2247, 2200 BC. And so that's the date that is typically given for that. And so Adam's family would have still been relatively young by comparison to the other ages of people that had been living. But the family would have been relatively young coming to the Tower of Babel. So they would have all been less than 100 for the most part, unless one of Adam or one of Noah's sons had been a part of the building. And so, but even then, they lost sight of what had just occurred with the flood and started to build the tower. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about, besides just what we see in the biblical text as far as the stories involved, is the people that are actually involved in these stories. And the first are Adam and Eve, and we talked about that a few moments ago, how God created them perfect and how they disobeyed God's commands and were banished from the Garden of Eden. And once they were banished, we have 3 sons recorded in Scripture. We have Cain and Abel and then Seth. And what we know about Adam is that he died at the age of 930. And as far as Eve goes, we have no record as to how old she was when she died. The next set of people that are integral to these stories are Cain and Abel. And we see them in chapter 4. And, after being taught what it meant to worship God by Adam and Eve, we see that Cain and Abel both approached God in worship, but they approached it differently. Cain was giving leftovers to some degree to God, and Abel was giving, his first of his flocks. And so when they gave those as their offerings, Cain became jealous of Abel's acceptance by God, because Cain was not accepted with his offerings, but Abel was, and he murdered him and then was banished by God. Now, Cain, according to a first century, so like only 1900 years ago, a first century AD writing is said to have lived to 730 years old. And we don't know how old Abel was when he died. It had to have been less than 130. Most likely he was less than 100 years old. Any real guesses are just conjecture. It's just a guess at that. We don't really know how old Cain was when he died, but that's a thing. If you start looking on the internet and reading some on it, you'll find I think that's actually the first century writing is reference to a Jewish tradition. And again, traditions are traditions. Another person in this set of time period that we're looking at that is of importance is Enoch. You see him on your timeline there. He's the father of Methuselah, right below the section talking about the Tower of Babel. He only lived 365 years, and that's a far cry from people that lived 960 years of age at this time. And Enoch was the great-grandfather of Noah, and he stood out in his time for being a righteous man who had a close relationship with God. And he's said to have walked with God, and then one day he just was gone. He just, disappeared, so to speak. And we know from the Scriptures that he was translated to heaven. And again, he's the first person that this happened to, and the other person was Elijah. Good job. And so Enoch was 365 whenever he was translated, that's the theological term, to heaven. But it shows us that those in Adam's line are pursuing God. We see that they have a relationship with him and are wanting to do that. And so Noah, just a few generations later, is considered to be a righteous man on his own accord. The next one I would mention to you is Methuselah, Enoch's son. He's credited with being the longest living person in world history at 969 years old. And as I said, he was around during the time that Noah built the ark, and would have been most likely, as any good grandpa would do, jumping in right there, helping, carry boards and put in the wooden dowels and all the things that need to be done. Do what? Well, that's a good question. Keith's question is, did Methuselah die due to the flood? Yes and no. And I'll tell you this, he didn't die in the flood, and that was my next thing. Methuselah did die the same year as the flood, and his name meant, when he dies, judgment. And so that's what Methuselah means. And so it's believed, and we don't know this for certain, but it's believed that the 7 days that Noah is on the ark between the time the door is closed and the flood and the rains start was the 7 days of mourning for Methuselah. It was typical that they mourned for 7 days. I don't know that that's the case. I've read that in a couple different places, and it is implied, but we do not know that for a fact. But so yes, he did die because of the same time as the flood, but it was because when he died, God was bringing the judgment. And so What that would show you is that there has to have been some kind of righteousness in Methuselah for God to have held off on the flood until he died, with God knowing when that would occur. The next one I would mention to you is Noah. We talked about him a few moments ago. Following in those footsteps of his great-grandfather Enoch, he was a righteous man in his own time who stood out spiritually in a very wicked world. And so Noah was told by God of the coming flood, and he built the ark and took the animals on there. And, he did preach for that 100 years trying to get people to repent. But nobody took him seriously, and they didn't do that. And the interesting thing for us is, when we look at Noah, all of humanity that is alive today can trace their lineage back to Noah. We may not be able to follow it exactly, this was this and this and this and this all the way back, but we know that because of the flood, all of humanity was wiped out. And so what that means for us is we can trace our lineage all the way back to Noah and his wife, and Noah's wife's name is Joan of Arc. Y'all should know that one. Okay, so, but nevertheless, Noah and his wife, we trace our lineage regardless of ethnicity, regardless of anything. So we're all family going back to Noah, regardless of how you view it. And so as we see that, we don't know specifically what son, Shem, Ham, or Japheth, that we track back through, but we all come back to Noah regardless. And so Noah lived 950 years. He lived 950 years. And the interesting thing is, he died when Abraham was 58 years old. So Abraham was probably living in Haran and had not left Haran at the age of 75 to go to Canaan. And so Noah died when Abraham was not even 60 years old. And so you can probably count on it that he probably had a strong connection, or an opportunity for a connection anyway, with the oral histories and traditions that they had passed on through that. Another one I would mention to you is Shem, and I mentioned him just a second ago. He is one of the sons of Noah. He is the one that the line of promise tracks through, and because of what we know, how old he was at the time of the flood and after the flood, because of what we read in Genesis 11:10, it tells us that he would have been 502. We know how he was 100 years old 2 years after the flood. And so what that means is Noah would have been 502 when Shem was born. And Shem had a son, and then that's where the line of promise continues to Abraham, and then to David, and then to Jesus. But this is the one that Shem is the son that the Jews track their history and their lineage back through to Noah, and then eventually back to Adam. But Shem lived to be 600, and if you look on your timeline there, Shem lived to be 600. And the interesting thing about him is that he outlived 7 of his next 8 descendants. And his son, great-grandson Eber is the only one that outlived him until he died. All of the other generations had died before him in those next 7. And interestingly, when Shem dies, Jacob and Esau, who we just finished talking about, they would have been 50 years old. And so Jacob and Esau most likely would have not traded or Jacob would not have stolen the birthright when Shem died, but he would have already had the blessing. He wouldn't have stolen the blessing, but he would have already traded a bowl of soup for the birthright. And so you see that he died in between those 2 events that we just studied in that section of Genesis. That's when Shem would have died. And so another one, the last one that I would mention to you, is a person by the name of Peleg. You see him on the timeline there. He's he's right above Eber. But Peleg is the 4th generation following Shem, and his notoriety comes about in Genesis 10:25 when it says, "In his time the earth was divided." Chapter 10 is another one of those genealogies, and it's following Shem's genealogy. And what ends up happening is it's reading, it tells you so-and-so begat so-and-so, and they were this age, and they lived this long, and then it gets to Peleg, and it mentions that in his time the earth was divided. And Bible scholars believe that this is a reference to the Tower of Babel, giving us a better date as for when it happened, or at least a time period for it to have happened. It would have happened in those 239 years that Peleg lived, but it's believed it was towards the beginning of his life. But when it says that the earth was divided, it doesn't mean the continents split. It means that humanity was divided. Humanity was divided across the globe. And so those are the people that I would point out to you in the first 11 chapters of Genesis. Now, I told you that I would share with you things that occur in world history during this time period that we're talking about. And so around that time period on your timeline that says 3000 BC, these are things that are happening in the world. Camels are domesticated in Egypt. Construction on Stonehenge in England begins. And the city of Troy, the Trojan horse, the city of Troy is founded in modern-day Turkey. And so those are just a couple of events that were happening around 3000 BC. Besides that, in 2000 BC, we know that horses were tamed and used for work. Construction on Stonehenge is largely finished. It took them 1,000 years to move all them rocks into place. Not only that, the last woolly mammoth is believed to go extinct on Wrangel Island in Russia. And that's sort of interesting when you think about the events of the world and what's going on. And that means that some of those massive animals that we know of from science would have been much smaller versions on the ark. But nevertheless, I told you that each night when we look at these sections, these periods of time on the timeline, one of the things that we're going to talk about each week is the timing of God's story, looking at basically how the timeline of the Bible plays out with the events in that time period and how they play into God's timing of his story of redeeming mankind. Now, in this part of the biblical text, when we look in Genesis 1 through 11, what we see is that we see almost every component of the redemption story being played out in front of us. And we first see that God created man to be in a relationship with him. He created us and created everything that we see. And he created us. He created humans for his great pleasure. That's what it is. He created us for his pleasure, but also to be in relationship with him. And that's why he created us. God was not lonely. God did not create us to be his equal, as some religions would tell you. Instead, he created us to be in a relationship with him so that we could love him, so that we could worship him, so that we could fellowship with him. And the relationship that mankind had with God at first was perfect. And redemption wasn't even a thought in the minds of mankind because Adam and Eve had a perfect relationship with him. But we then see that man broke that relationship by sinning against God. And with the introduction of sin into the world, that perfect relationship between God and man was broken forever. There was never another opportunity for mankind to have the same perfect relationship that they had with God before Adam and Eve sinned in the garden. It's sort of like if you took your favorite coffee mug and you dropped it and it chipped or it broke and you tried to glue it back together. It might look good, but are you going to pour coffee in that if it is, shattered into about 10 pieces and you glued it back together? No, you're probably just going to give up on it, right? Because the reality is it's not going to be the same as it was before. And the relationship between mankind and God was never the same after that. Now, we have an opportunity to make things right with God, but it's not the same. It's not the same relationship that they were able to experience. And so no longer would man have that perfect love, that perfect worship, that perfect fellowship with God, and like they did before sin occurred. And so sin caused man to be spiritually separated from God, as you hear me say so often. And now mankind needed to be redeemed. They needed to be brought back into fellowship with God. And so finally we see that God made a way for man to once again be in a relationship with him. That God was making a way. Now in Genesis 3:15 we read about God's plan for the redemption of mankind. We read the first prophecy in the Bible that there would be a Messiah, a Redeemer, a Deliverer that would come and deliver mankind from their sins. That would bring that redemption. And it says in Genesis 3:15 And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel. That's God's curse to Satan, to the serpent. And as he is speaking to Satan, God tells him that the Messiah would defeat him and deliver mankind from the grip of sin. And so we see that these first three requirements or events for the redemption of mankind, that all three of these have occurred. We see that God created us to be in relationship with him. We see that man broke that relationship by sinning against God, and then God made a way for man to once again be in relationship with him. And we see that God had a plan. And this, the thing you have to remember is that mankind's sin did not catch God by surprise. So it's not like God's like, oh no, man has sinned. I need to figure something out. And he's like, okay, well, I'll send my son. It didn't work that way. From eternity past, when it was just God in existence, there was no anything other than God. In his infinite wisdom, he had already known he would create man, that man would sin, and some way would have to be created for them to be redeemed. And so he knew in eternity past, before time began, before creation event happened, all of that he would send Jesus to be our Redeemer. How crazy is that to us, that God knew for infinity that this was going to happen, and he created everything anyway. He loved us enough and wanted us to be in relationship with him enough that he created everything and still allowed us to go through the process of sinning against him and him sending the Redeemer to bring us back into relationship with him. The only part, I hit the wrong button on my iPad. Okay. The only part of God's redemptive plan that we do not see in Genesis 1 through 11, which we will pick up in several weeks, that we will pick up then, is that we are missing the actual act of redemption. That thing happens to bring us redemption, which is the death of Christ. And so it's not until we get to the Gospels and we're looking at the life of Christ that we see this actually happen. And from our perspective, that's 4,000 years of world history nearly. 4,000 years of man living in sin before Jesus comes and dies on the cross for all of humanity. And so from the time that we close up shop tonight at the Tower of Babel, it's another 2,200 years until Jesus is hanging on a cross in Jerusalem, dying for the sins of the world. And so we're gonna get there, and we're gonna go beyond that, but it's gonna take us a little time before we get there. And so we're gonna start looking at how God works this narrative thread through this redemptive thread through the narrative of the chronology of the Bible. And so that is the end of our study for tonight. I'm curious to do this, but are there any questions? Jenny. Let's go to Genesis 1 to answer that. Because I debated on that, and some of the things I read pointed to just say you ought to just put light. And so I don't have a good answer beyond that. That was some of the things that I read. But in Genesis chapter 1, and that's verses 1 through 5, the question for those at home, or if you didn't hear it here in the sanctuary, was when we look at day 1, do we add more to light, such as the heavens and the earth and the water? And so let's look at Genesis 1, 1 through 5. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And that may just be a description of what God did, but I think that we would probably be okay with adding heavens and earth in there to some degree. But the challenge there is, I could agree with earth. Well, I guess you would say the firmament is heaven. So I mean, because the heavens, it depends on what is defined as heavens, because there's technically 3 heavens if you look at it from the biblical perspective. There's the heavens, the atmosphere around us. There's the outside of our atmosphere, which would be space as we would know it, and then the third heaven would be the spiritual heaven. And so it says, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. So obviously the earth is there. So we have to include the earth there. on the first day of creation. So I would take your pen or pencil and write beside light, put the earth. Because I debated on whether to put heavens and earth on here when I was putting that together. It says, darkness was over the surface of the deep, which would be water, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw the light was good, and he separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. There was evening, and there was morning the first day. So from a biblical look at that, I would say that we would be okay with putting beyond just light. We could put the heavens and the earth, with the heavens most likely being, and I would have to go and do a little research, most likely the spiritual heavens, rather than the spiritual heavens and the physical earth as we know it, and then the waters of the deep, as it says there. So yes, good job, Jenny. The same way we'll have light in the New Jerusalem. God is our light. I've read that before. That's not me being a smart aleck. That's something I have read before, was that, because that's the question, where did the light source come from if it wasn't, if the sun wasn't created until? And so my understanding from what I've read in other places is that it would be that God was the light, that was, where he, not that he was created, let me clarify that, but that God created light and was the source of light, I guess I should say. Does that make sense? Well, eventually, yes, but as you see there on the fourth day, that's when he created the greater light and the lesser light, the moon and the sun and the stars. And so the sun isn't created until then. And that's a great theological question, Scott, because there's people who say, well, how do you have light without the sun in the context of the way the solar system works and all of that. I have read that a couple of times, and that was something that was discussed in a theology class I took earlier in this semester, and that was a discussion that was in the creation portion of the theology class. And so they didn't give a great answer to that. I mean, like a solid, this is the answer, other than God had to have been the source of light, but he created light, for that on that day. That's a good observation, Larry. That if you didn't hear Larry, he said it may not have been light as we know it, and but there had to have been an accounting of a day and a night, because it tells us that there. How that works, because like Keith, like you said, the sun is what regulates for us a day and a night. But in this context, as best we know, God was the source of light, but he regulated that light as a creation event for that. Was there somebody else that had a question? Alta, did you have a question? When we look at Genesis chapter 11, it just says that he scattered them, basically dispersed them across the globe, or dispersed them. So how that would have worked, it's not with the Mormon view that, there were civilizations in the United States that there's no archaeological evidence for or anything like that. But as far as how God dispersed or scattered them, we don't know, but it would make sense that he would have placed them where they needed to be to cross land bridges from Russia to the United States, or to do whatever that would look like. But I don't have the easy answer would be yes, God had to have put people either in the Americas or have put them where they could easily get into the Americas from, Russia or, that region. But again, we don't know what the geography exactly looked like then, so it could have been a little different, but probably nothing more than an ice bridge or a land bridge between Russia and Alaska. But the probably the best way to look at that is when it says that he scattered them, then he would have strategically put them where they would need to be on all of the continents that we know of, and how that works. I don't know if that I don't know if I said yes to your answer or your question or not, but I think I take it on faith that what it tells us is what we what we understand it to be there, and so ex- yeah, exactly. Was there another question over here? Did somebody have a question? The answer should be yes, because nothing, God has. When we look at the first part of chapter 2 of Genesis, when it says that God rested, it doesn't mean like how many of you took a nap on this afternoon? Fess up, folks. You took a nap, right? Okay. You rested, right? That's what you did. You rested. Well, it was because you were tired, right? Well, God in Genesis chapter 2, there in the first couple of verses, when he rested, he did not rest as in being tired. It literally means he ceased from creating. That's what it means our best term for it is rest. And so he ceased from creating, so that there was no longer a creative action after that. So all of the water that is presently on earth and has ever existed was yes, it was created during the creation event. It's believed that what happened, or from a scientific perspective, a biblical scientific perspective, what is believed to have happened is when God created the earth, there was when he says the sky separated the firmaments, that what that is the lower firmament would have been the water on the earth that we, the seas and the oceans and things like that. The upper firmament would have been a vapor barrier, a vapor layer around the world that collapsed during the flood and rose the sea levels to where they are now, and was so high that it, cuts channels into the earth, into the Marianas Trench near Japan and all that, and the water levels came to where they rested, where they are now, after all of the turbulence of the flood. And so all the water that we know and have existed, but there had never been rain because that vapor layer would have prevented the need for it. And when the flood came, the collapse of that moisture layer would have been the rain that they experienced. And that set in place the weather cycle of clouds and storms and rain as we know it. But yeah, the amount of water that was then is the same amount that we have now. Whether it's frozen at the poles or Greenland or Antarctica or whatever, it's all the same amount of water. Good question. Wasn't expecting that one. And I don't know what to expect as far as some of these questions, just because there's so much to look over. Any other questions before we wrap up for tonight? That was a good job. All right. Next time that we're together, which is next Sunday night, we will be looking at the time of the patriarchs. So basically, from 2200, give or take, until about 1635, which would be with the death of Joseph. And so we'll be looking at that time period in the next time. So hold on to this. This timeline, put it into your Bible and hold on to it for next time. If you lose it between now and then, we'll have some extra copies of it, but we'll use that one for the next one, and then after that, we'll pick up with the Exodus and the conqueror, or leading to the conquering of Canaan. And so, hope that you'll be with us on Wednesday night at 7 o'clock for our continued study of the book of Ephesians. And not only that, we'll have our youth and children's classes. We'll have supper at 6 o'clock. Don't miss it. And then next Sunday morning, we will continue in our series on the Gospels, and then pick up Sunday evening with the patriarchs. And so with that being said, I'm going to ask Ken if he would to close us with a word of prayer, and we'll be dismissed.